Thank you for your patience for the last session. For mutual understanding, I have prepared a brief on the global regulatory trends. According to a survey performed by the Bank of International Settlement, more than 60% of the country's jurisdictions possess or are creating a regulatory framework for digital assets, and most are bringing forward bespoke regulation because their existing regulatory frameworks do not cover the digital assets. The main objectives of regulation is the protection of investors and financial stability, countering illicit activities, and ensuring fair, efficient, and transparent market, and the safety and soundness of the regulated institutions and infrastructures. Let's see South Korea. Under the Act on Specified Financial Information Act, the domestic virtual asset service providers must comply with the AML obligations, including the trabelul, and must comply with the special provisions, including the notification of requirements, business requirements qualified, and the use of banking account, the real name identified for individual retail investors, and the prohibition of handling virtual assets issued by themselves or related parties. From July this year, we have another Phase 1 Act on the protection of virtual asset investors' users. Under the Act requires safekeeping of virtual assets and the deposited money of users, and prohibit unfair practices, market abuse in the market, and requires platform operators to monitor and oversight market manipulations or market abuse in real time. Most of the postponed issues are expected to be included in the secondary Phase 2 legislation, which is now covered by the guidelines on the best practices of self-regulatory body. And then the current Foreign Exchange Transaction Act will be added to embrace the cross-border transaction of virtual assets, including the reporting obligations of virtual asset service providers to the central bank. Let's see the international organizations and standard setting bodies. The international organizations and standard setting bodies, including FATF and IOSCO, have been recommending principles and guidelines for crypto and digital assets. On October 2003, G20's finance ministers and central bank governors adopted a joint report from IMF and FSBs with a roadmap of implementation. And OECD in October 2022 issued CARF, a crypto asset reporting framework, to support transmission of information among the tax authorities. Let's see in Singapore. In Singapore, under the leadership of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, has enacted the Payment Services Act and the Financial Services and Bills of 2023, and has been promoting several meaningful projects in fields of optimizing cross-border payment with the CBDCs and blockchain-based interbank clearing network and multi-currency clearing, named such as Ubin, Orchid, Petior, Dunbar, and must also issue policies and guidelines, including on stablecoins after relevant several consultations. Let's see Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, the authority has taken incremental approaches expanding the regulatory parameters. The Monetary Authority and the Securities and Futures Commission issued policy statements and frameworks and guidelines with prior consultations. Under the amended AML law ordinance, the virtual asset trading platforms business are supervised by the Securities and Futures Commission, which implementing the licensing regime. The background brief of Legislative Council shows well this background and development of regulation in Hong Kong. Let's see the European Union of 27 member states. In European Union, package bills were enacted under the digital finance strategy, including a regulatory sandbox law called DLT pilot version, and the regulation on market in crypto assets, and the AML regulations. Meanwhile, in order to ensure the cyber hygiene, the regulation on digital resilience for the financial sector was also enacted and is ahead of implementation. In the European Union, the regulation is the law applied directly to the member states. And let's see the United States of America. USA consists of 50 states, very big nations. As we well know, during his campaign, presidential-elect Trump has called for the United States to be the crypto capital of the planet and mentioned a national strategic Bitcoin stockpile. And the relevant Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Act is proposed in the Senate. Until now, due to the lack of federal-level regulatory guidance, states like New York, California, and Wyoming has taken the lead on the building and implementation the appropriate policies. Meanwhile, in the absence of statutory regulatory clarity, with numerous operation choke points like enforcement actions of Securities and Exchange Commission, digital asset companies are actively petitioning for the more concrete rules and regulations and increased clarity. Several bills were introduced in Congress. For example, the Responsible Innovation and Technology Innovation Act and the Fitonian Financial Innovation and Technology Act for the 21st century. Bill was introduced, which include special provisions that intend to put an end to so-called investment contract controversies, clarifying the jurisdiction of CFTC and the SEC. There are also other leading jurisdictions like Dubai and the United Kingdom and Japan. This is the brief that I prepared. Let's start the discussion. What's the current status implementation of regulations in your jurisdictions. And with your insight, please deliver us your great opinion.
Sure.
Understand?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. I'm Jason Somensato. I run U.S. public policy for Chainalysis. But I had spent about 3 years in the government at the CFTC, working specifically on crypto policy. So I think there is a lot of attention in the US on the status of crypto policy as it is and the expectation of how it might change and where it might go. I think it's important to understand that in the US, the vast majority of the regulations that apply to the crypto industry are not specifically written for the crypto industry. They are legacy regulations for securities, for derivatives and commodities, for banks, that are then applied to the crypto ecosystem. And so I think there's been a lot of criticism, particularly from the industry, as to how the regulators have interpreted and enforced those regulations in a way that didn't give much flexibility to companies to explore new business models and new market structures. And I think there's an expectation that that regulatory opposition and attitude towards these companies will likely change now as a result of the election. I think it will be interesting to see who ends up in some of the regulatory positions of power, what some of the interpretations that they had. As you pointed out in your brief, the other kind of big thing that is happening in the US at the same time is, for the past couple years now, but definitely over the last year, there have been efforts by the legislature, by Congress, to create a new regulatory regime that would be specific to the crypto industry. There's actually like several different paths by which legislation has been proposed relating to trading markets, to stable coins, and to several other issues. And I think there, you're gonna see a less, you're not gonna see as fast of a response to the new government, because ultimately passing new legislation takes a while. Congress is historically pretty slow at the process and has a difficult time coming to consensus. And so we are definitely in a transition period in the US to see kind of what the new regulatory ecosystem will look like and whether there's going to be more momentum to actually pass legislation.
Will the FIT21 will survive in the Trump's administration?
Yeah, so FIT21 is the bill that probably got the farthest along towards being finalized as legislation that, as you pointed out, would have split authority for regulating crypto exchanges and marketplaces between my old agency, the CFTC, and the SEC. I think that issue and legislation on that topic in particular is going to be top of mind, a priority for Congress so for people who don't understand, in January, a new Congress will come in as a result of this election. I'm not sure it'll be called FIT21. I'm not sure if there's going to be changes to the draft. I think there's some expectation that there'll be revisions, but I think the idea of Congress telling the regulators who has authority for which assets, how that authority is going to be applied, is going to be a priority, and that FIT21 models a lot of what we see in things like MiCA and other jurisdictions, and so in that way, yes, it'll definitely survive, and I think the question is, will it get across the line to be passed as legislation?
Let's invite great experts who deeply engaged in the crafting MiCA. What about you?
Thank you very much for the wonderful summary you had over there. For much of those...
Sorry to interrupt. You are the father of Mika?
No, I'm not the father of Mika. Mika is a collective work of about 200 people. And I always start with a wonderful joke. You know, the European Union operates in the same way that North Korea operates. North Korea. We have the European Parliament, which is the only parliament other than the North Korea that cannot introduce regulation. So the European Commission introduced the regulation, and we have one copy of it in the European Parliament, one copy of in the European Council. We amend the regulation, and then we meet in the trialogues and work on this to finalize the text. Now, I worked specifically on the Title II and Title III of MiCA. For those who are not familiar, is the other tokens part of the regulation, and the asset reference tokens, which is one of the two flavors of stablecoins of MiCA. And yes, with this opportunity, I want to give a little bit of background. Everybody says that the motivation for us to create MiCA was Libra, the stablecoin introduced by Facebook at some point. And everybody was super scared in the United States and Europe. Well, to be a little bit precise, the main motivation for us to start MiCA was not Libra per se, but the inability of the people who are running Libra to explain their profitability model. Practically, when we start drafting MiCA, we had three things in our mind. The business model of those who issue tokens and those who operate with tokens, the operational model and the profitability model. So my suggestion to everyone is when they are looking at MiCA, MiCA is not enough. It's MiCA plus 13 regulations related to operational resilience, to anti-money laundering, to cybersecurity, related to everything. So where we are standing in terms of implementation. Everything starts now. The Title 3 and Title 4 tokens, the stable coins part of MiCA is already in the process of implementation since June. And all the rest of the regulation, including the crypto asset service providers provisions, the other reference tokens or utility tokens provisions, and the supervisory framework is going to be implemented from the 30th of December. We expect not necessarily an easy period in the coming 2 years, because drafting the regulation is one thing, implementing a regulation is a completely different story. And
the provision of grandfather.
To give you just a number, the MiCA regulation is 160 pages. The implementing regulatory and technical standards is 1,460 pages so far. We still wait for some pages to come following this. It's not necessarily a bad thing to tick boxes, but we have still now in the process of regulatory and technical standards to address significant existential problems.
By this time, let's invite Angela Ang, expert from Singapore. She was at the Monetary Authority of Singapore.
감사합니다. 여러분 안녕하세요.
Wow, what a surprise!
Yeah. I actually studied in Korea. 6개월 동안 한국에서 살았어요. 저 한국말 조금 할 수 있어요. 반갑습니다, 여러분. 저는 TRM랩스 온 Senior Policy Advisor Angela입니다. 잘 부탁드립니다. 두나무하고 핫빛 오늘 초대해 주셔서 감사합니다. Okay, I'm going to switch to English now. We're going to talk serious stuff about regulations in Singapore, and I'm probably going to mess it up in Korean. So I think, Mr. Lee, you gave a very good summary of everything that's happened in Singapore. Singapore was basically one of the first jurisdictions in the world to introduce a specialized regulatory framework for crypto back in 2020. I think there were maybe one of the first 5 in the world. And I was part of the team that kind of was tasked with taking that Payment Services Act and implementing it. Like Dimitris has already said, drafting the policies is one thing, implementation is a whole other story. So we kind of had to go through the process of setting up the licensing framework, the supervision framework. Okay, now we know that we want crypto service providers or digital payment token service providers, as we call them in Singapore, to be licensed. But what are the expectations and what does that look like in practical detail? So in the very beginning, the regime was very much focused on two things: AML risks as well as technology risk, because I think at that point, like hacks were already known to be a bit more prevalent, and so I think at that point it was like consumer protection the approach was caveat emptor. If you're going to engage with crypto, know that it's high risk and volatile, and there's no consumer protection. Of course, that has massively changed post-FTX, and as you pointed out in your brief, MES spent basically most of 2022 and 2023 kind of articulating consumer protection measures. And I think right now in 2024 and going to 2025, we're very much focused on implementation. We're very lucky in Singapore to have had that regulatory clarity. And now we're focused on, implementing the consumer protection measures. For example, since 2022, actually advertising has been disallowed in Singapore by licensed crypto service providers. Crypto ATMs have been banned since then as well. And now they're bringing in additional measures, for example, introducing a knowledge assessment for retail investors that want to engage with crypto investing. There are no more referral and sign-up incentives. More importantly, segregation of customer and proprietary assets, custody of these assets, both fiat and crypto. And they've also actually introduced kind of expanded the crypto licensing regime to include crypto custodians. So that's implemented as well now. And the Financial Services and Markets Act. That's actually a very interesting one that you covered in your brief that not a lot of people talk about. And I think the goal there is that the initial framework was meant for service providers who are providing crypto services in Singapore. And because of the Financial Action Task Force requirements that you should have jurisdiction over service providers that are registered in your jurisdiction, that was the goal of the FSMA. That as long as you're incorporated in Singapore, whether or not you're providing services in Singapore, I'm going to create a licensing obligation. But they have also very clearly said in their consultation that I'm not looking to license people under this framework, because if you are going to incorporate your entity in Singapore, that should be substantive business activity, and there is no reason the MES is thinking that I will license a service provider that doesn't have that presence. So it's quite interesting. And I think, we're really kind of like going into the weeds and into the details of implementation right now in Singapore. And I think the whole process has been guided by kind of MES ethos in terms of how they look at policy making, how they look at rulemaking, which is kind of that engagement process with the private sector. And I think when it comes to implementation, that's very important, because you may have some objectives in mind, but if the implementation is not practical, if the rules are not practical, it doesn't get implemented properly, you don't get to achieve your regulatory objectives as well. So I think in this implementation phase, we've continued to see that consultative approach in Singapore, which has driven regulatory kind of implementation in a quite positive way.
This is time for Clara. She was the fintech head and the licensing director at the Securities and Futures Commission in Hong Kong.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me today. As just said, I was the fintech head and license director of the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission, which is the financial regulator in Hong Kong. And then the journey for Hong Kong HKS SFC as well, to regulate the virtual asset space started in 2017 when I was a fintech head there. And then at that time, I saw that the virtual asset activities, in fact, were emerging with the traditional financial sector. So I initiated that in Hong Kong we should start to regulate virtual assets. At that time, it was a pioneer. We are the pioneer internationally to start this regulatory framework. And because of this, later on, we also had a lot of discussion with US SEC or UK FCA and Singapore MAS as well. And then at that time, in 2017, when I initiated the whole idea of regulating virtual assets, the most prominent things to regulate at that time, as you may recall, there was a boom of ICOs at that time. So the framework was to cover how to regulate the ICO activity, in which we had a regulatory framework for virtual assets fund manager, because ICO is kind of like collective investment scheme or investment agreements. And then another thing is there were some very prominent international unregulated crypto exchange in Hong Kong at that time. So we also had our regulatory framework for regulating virtual asset trading platform. And with a lot of debate and all these, in Hong Kong in 2019, we had a very clear licensing and supervisory regulatory framework for giving license to virtual asset trading platform at that time. So we started to have that regulations of VATP and VA fund managers in 2019. But at that time, there was another question, because we are Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission. And then for some like Bitcoin or Ether, they are virtual commodities instead of securities or futures. Mm-hmm. So there was a question why we had the jurisdiction or the legal power to regulate these activities. But because of this, we would like to have a quick fix. We use administrative steps. So at that time, we call it as regulatory framework for these licensing and supervisory powers. And then we had this kind of regulatory expectation and give license out, but at the same time, we also have to change our law so that to give proper legal foundation for the Securities Commission, for the SFC to regulate this area. So you can see that in 2022, we finally have all these guidelines, or we changed the law so as to give full power for the financial regulators to regulate this market. And in the last 2-3 years, we also try to make our regulatory framework more comprehensive. So we also have published some guidelines on tokenization, on broker-dealers to deal in or help clients to trade in these virtual commodities or virtual assets. Mm-hmm. And then we also have like crypto advisor license as well. And then in the next 1 or 2 years, we would, in Hong Kong, I hope to see that we will have licensing and regulatory and supervisory framework for virtual assets custodians. And we are also going to regulate the virtual asset OTC market. And lastly, of course, stablecoins, the area as well. So hopefully in 2 years, we could cover the majority of all virtual asset activities in Hong Kong.
Actually, we don't have enough time. But Dimitris, can you mention on the DLT pilot regime in the European Union?
Okay, super. DLT pilot regime is the last piece of regulation that actually participated drafting. It's my favorite piece compared to MiCA, because it is about not the instruments, but it's about the infrastructure. So imagine that you want to tokenize financial instruments like a bond or equity or a derivative. These instruments do not fall under MiCA. They are MiFID instruments, and they are regulated within the framework of the current regulation. But when you tokenize it, we need to go back and see if the existing financial value chain reflects the needs of a tokenized instrument. Does the placement, trading, clearing, and settlement is to be performed in exactly the same way as it used to be when the bonds and stocks were in plain digital or paper form. So the DLT pilot regime is about how we make a DLT-based financial value chain with trading, clearing, and settlement on-chain. And the most innovative part of the story is that we try to experiment with schemes that actually remove the clearing house from the process. This is huge. Not necessarily because we get rid of a problem, an intermediary, or a main player who actually acts as a risk service provider, but because imagine that you are in Washington and you say, okay, DTCC belongs to the past. We don't need it anymore. Actually, this is the real innovation of blockchain. Now, it's a pilot regime, so effectively it's a sandbox. It has a 5 to 6 years time of implementation. We will collect the knowledge in these 5 years, and we will come up with a regulation that actually will give existence to a completely different financial value chain. To me, this is much more important and much bigger than MiCA.
Let's talk about the level playing field globally. I think the regulation should be the process to prepare rules and regimes to be the playing field for the crypto industry. Let's approach this issue with in-field access to the products in the digital asset market. In Korea, for example, we do not provide derivatives related with digital assets. The access to the digital asset market is allowed only for retail investors, not for corporate or institutional investors. This aspect is totally opposite when compared to the global foreign digital asset exchanges. What do you think about this? What should be done to have in place for the level playing field?
I think it's an incredibly hard problem to solve because the way that I see it, when I was at the CFTC outside of the crypto ecosystem, one of the hardest challenges was figuring out how do you adopt or create a level playing field with international jurisdictions as it relates to just the derivatives market, a market that's very sophisticated and robust. And there were very long discussions over whether another country's regulatory environment was sufficiently protective and up to the standards that the CFTC could allow a company operating in that jurisdiction to also operate in the US. And the tricky part with the crypto market in my mind is that the crypto market grew up as a global market, and it's very early in its development. And so for the traders and the people who are engaged in it, they are used to global access to the marketplace, being able to move their assets through, multiple different chains wherever they need to. And at least when you look from like a US perspective, we are still having a big debate inside the US as to what is the right way to create the standards inside the US as for how this is going to regulate it. And that's almost a prerequisite before you even get to the conversation of, does this meet, what do we do with other countries' regulatory regimes? So I don't think it's a very easy problem to solve. I tend to think it will probably be solved in the same way that kind of international standardization of markets has developed in the traditional market space, which is large jurisdictions like the EU, like the major APAC countries, like the US, will implement some level of regulation, and then you're going to spend a lot of time in international organizations like IOSCO trying to figure out like what does harmonization look like. So yeah, I think that is. It's like people know that it's necessary, but I tend to think it's a very difficult problem at least from a US perspective.
And maybe just to add on to that, I think the issue is that, what is the best regulatory framework for crypto? I don't think there's one answer to that
Right.
question. I think it depends, right? Like a lot of things, it depends on what are your objectives, what are your priorities, how, monetary policy, or, even like, how permissive you want to be in terms of your investor base. There's no kind of right answer, and every country is different. So I personally don't think that we will have kind of like that 100% regulatory harmonization where we have kind of the same standard for crypto regulation across the world. But I think what we are achieving today through the standard setting bodies is kind of like a minimum standard, right? And a common understanding of certain definitions. For example, I think regulators across the world are converging to a similar understanding of what a stablecoin is. Most regulators today agree that an algorithmic stablecoin is not something they would consider a stablecoin. Most regulators are expecting stablecoins to be 100% backed by liquid reserve assets. They're expecting stablecoins to be redeemable into the underlying fiat currency in a timely manner. There are these commonalities that are emerging because I think regulators recognize that in an industry that's as borderless as crypto, you have to have some kind of coordination and consistency, but it will never be 100% because ultimately I think every market has different needs and every government has a different philosophy of how they look at digital assets.
What about Clara?
Well, that maybe I share my experience in drafting all these virtual asset regulations for Hong Kong. When I study the subject and I draft the regulations in 2018 for Hong Kong in relation to virtual asset trading platform, at that time, the requirement is totally opposite to what you have in Korea now. Because at that time, we have a requirement that only professional investors, that means like institutional clients and corporate clients, only professional investors could have access to licensed virtual asset trading platform in Hong Kong. Because at that time, we think that virtual asset is a very new area, and our regulations is also kind of a pioneer as well. So we have to be very prudent to protect the investors as well. And then we think institutional clients or corporate clients, they have more financial resources, they have expertise, they could better take care of themselves rather than individuals. That's why at that time, we said that even if we give license to virtual asset trading platform in Hong Kong, only professional investors should have access to it. And then that was our requirements in 2019. And gradually, with all these virtual asset knowledge more widespread in the world, and general public have more idea about what it is and know the risky nature of it. So in 2022, Hong Kong SFC only opened the virtual asset trading platform service to general public. So now in Hong Kong, retail can also have access to this virtual asset trading platform, but only since 2022. But for PI, from day one, we allow them to use these platforms.
We have a lot of things to do to prepare to going forward for the secondary piece of legislation. Let's move on to the rule-making process. As I briefed, when I look at the global practices, most jurisdictions like European Union and the United States, Hong Kong and Singapore perform the public consultation process. In the European Union, the inter-institutional agreement on the better lawmaking also underscores the process. Why the public consultation is so important in the process of rulemaking?
Of course it's important, because imagine a regulatory authority or lawmakers who have no clue about something so new to step in and introduce laws without knowing what is out there. So it's a learning process that we cannot avoid, and actually we need to encourage. And the consultation is just one part of the story. The other part of the story is the constant interaction with all those companies, from big companies to small startups, who should have an immediate access to the lawmakers to come and present their business models, to come and present how they generate value, how they transfer value, and how they capture value. All this started, for example, in the case of the European Union in 2016, when we had to introduce this blockchain resolution that I drafted back then. We had no clue at all. So for me, the process of drafting it was all about meeting 20 different entities, 20 different groups of people, mainly startups, super crazy some of them, super conservative some of them, showing possible applications of blockchain, not just in finance, also in other areas. In this process I learned, because the worst kind of regulator is the one who says, oh, I know that. Oh, I have a bias about it, and look at the other side, most probably is a bad thing. So this is something we need to avoid. Learn is very important.
All right.
Yeah, I think it gets to the heart of like probably the biggest criticism that people have with the US regulatory system. And so I worked at the CFTC, and there was a lot of discussion about a turf war between us and the SEC. And I tend to think it was a bit of a mischaracterization, and probably the more accurate characterization is that my boss, Chairman Benham, thought like we needed to get to a point where we were writing rules. Because for people who don't know, it's like you pass laws, but really the details come through the rule writing process, in which you get 1,000-page rules that everybody can read and comment on, and it takes a while, but it's an important process. And that the approach that the SEC was taking and has been taking for some time is to say, listen, the rule book is already written. We're going to enforce against these rules if you don't comply with them. And the problem that that created was that people were trying to interpret what the regulator meant through the responses to that enforcement action, which is tricky, right? Because those are very much dependent on the specific facts of the case. So I think getting to that rule writing process is kind of the key thing that the US needs to get to, and it'll be interesting to see if we get there.
Yeah, I think, I totally agree with Dimitris. You need to have a very open, attitude to learning. And I would say it's both ways, right? Because when we started regulating crypto at the MES in 2020, suddenly we're dealing with an industry that is so new to regulation. And a lot of them, frankly, when you interact with them, we found that they're not used to speaking regulator, right? And likewise, you're also learning the technology. So I think, the regulators are learning how to understand the industry. Industry is also learning how to understand the regulators. And I mean, frankly, I think sometimes when there's a lot of frustration with the process, right, it can get very tense. And what I always say is it's good to always remember there's a human being on the other side of the process. Regulators are, at least I wasn't trying to kill your business. I think at the end of the day, we kind of want the same overarching goal, which is that you want to create a safe and sustainable pace of growth. I think here in Asia, that is a narrative that we hear a lot, that we want to encourage growth and innovation of Web3, but we're also concerned with consumer protection. So I think it's kind of important to remember that we are kind of after that same overall goal in terms of that engagement process. And I think to really keep an open mind and try and understand, when you're communicating your objectives, what the other side's objectives are.
Yeah, and for me,
Sure.
for me, being a regulator for about 14 and 15 years, from my own experience with the Hong Kong SFC and my contact with other financial regulators globally, my understanding is that most of the people working in financial regulators, they are lawyers, accountants, and some of them are from financial industry, not many from tech background. They are from tech background minority. And then for virtual asset area, this is a very, very new industry. And I think people need to have some kind of tech knowledge and then know how to run the business as well. And then maybe some financial background or legal background is also a bonus. And so it's kind of like you have to know a lot of things so as to understand how the a virtual asset business could, how it works. So for me, I think public consultation is extremely important when regulators to set the regulations for these and implement it. Because sometimes I also see in some areas, regulators just in their office and then set out all those rules. And then they think the real work that way. When the regulations come out, it's totally nonsense. No one actually can comply with those regulations. So public consultation is extremely important. And for my experience, if sometimes we really have to put out something so as to protect the industry, and then we need to do things quickly, I can understand that at that kind of special situation, public consultation may not be possible because it takes time for public consultation and legislative changes. But those, you could do it or change the regulatory expectations, we call, in a short period of time, but that should be interim measures. And in the long run, when you really want to regulate the market, you need to have proper and solid legal grounding, and that's why you should go for public consultation. And for me, I would see that when I was a regulator, now I run my consulting firm, but when I was a regulator, I always see that the industry player like a partner or our source of information for me to set the regulation in a proportionate, reasonable way.
May I say something? Because we speak about consultations. Consultation is one thing. The most fundamental of all is all of us, I mean, United States, Europe, Singapore, Hong Kong, to have the political support to make a mistake. Without political support, nothing can move forward. I mean, we would never have competitive advantage in the European Union in this space if it was not for Eva Kaili, one member of the European Parliament who took all the responsibility on her shoulders. Same thing I suspect in the United States. If you don't have a strong player to say, yes, this is the policy, end of story. We need somebody to hold our back. Huh?
Yes, it's a critical point. And the ongoing dialogue between the public sector and private sector also important because this can ensure regulations that are not only responsive to the current demands, but also adaptable to future developments. The public consultation is a two-way communication between public and private sectors. The public sectors in the industry practitioners can prepare the future landscape of regulations. We are going out of time. We have a question from the audience. Let me read. In an industry built on the principle of decentralization, regulation seems to somewhat contradictory. Would regulation promote the development of this industry or would it hinder it? Who asked this?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at it. I think, again, my answer is it depends. Regulation that is clear and is proportionate, that takes into account, for example, how the industry is structured, how the technology works, can actually help to promote the development of the industry. In fact, last year, my team at TRM, we kind of studied regulatory developments all around the world, and we found that in jurisdictions where you have full licensing regimes, the rate of illicit activity is lower than in jurisdictions where you have less stringent regulatory frameworks or no regulation. And so, there's an obvious outcome that regulation is achieving here, which is that it is kind of bringing down the overall level of, financial crime. And I think that is a good outcome for the industry as a whole because it builds trust, and it kind of promotes safe and sustainable growth. But I think, it's important to remember that the devil is in the details.
Are you in favor of decentralized finance regulation?
No, I'm talking about the questions on regulation in general.
Centralization.
So if you're talking
We're
about
running out of time.
Yeah, but it's a provocative question.
yeah, so I think if we're talking about decentralization, it's also important to remember there's a fair bit of users that are interacting with the digital assets industry in a very centralized way.
Let me
Yeah.
say this. It's critical for the digital asset industry globally to enable policymakers and regulators to craft effective and harmonized frameworks that promote innovation while safeguarding stakeholders. A well-defined and flexible regulatory framework informed by diverse experiences is paramount because it provides the clarity necessary for the industry. These remarks from the World Economic Forum I have prepared. Thank you very much for listening us for such a long time, and thank you for your great expertise. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.